I'm delighted to be here. I'm Mary Bousted. I'm Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, and I'm chairing this fringe this evening. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted that you're all here too. We're here to become more acquainted with the life and works of Walter Citrine through a discussion of his life and works, which we based on a book, Walter Citrine, Forgotten Statesman of the Trade Union Congress, and the book's by Dr. Jim Moher, who's here as well, and he will be in conversation with Tom Wilson. So Jim was a national official of the TNGWU and for the CWU for much of his career. Whilst still working full-time in 1989, he presented an original thesis on the history of early engineering and millwrights trade combinations, for which he received a London University PhD. He's been a visiting fellow at the Institute of Contemporary British History at King's College London since 2008. He was also a founder member of the History and Policy Trade Union Forum, which examines the role of industrial relations and employment to inform current policy development. Jim was until recently chair of the Wembley History Society, and he lectures frequently on Citrine's Wembley, Harrow and Liverpool connections. Asking the questions will be my great friend, Tom Wilson. Used to, of course, many of you at the TUC will know him, and Tom's last role at the TUC was as director of the Union Learn Fund, a fund which did so much fantastic work, so much good for particularly the lowest paid, the least skilled workers, and which has been, the funding was cut in an act of spectacular stupidity, viciousness and spite by the current Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, whose name will be remembered in ignominy for what he did. So the way that this evening will run is that Tom will be asking Jim questions about Citrine and about his book, and then I will open it up for anybody in the Fringe meeting audience to ask questions as well. Also on the panel or on screen is Philip Murphy, and he's Professor Philip Murphy, who is the Institute of History director. And we've also got Gemma Dormer, who is the administrator there, and she did, it's from the Institute of Historical Research, I'm sorry. And we've got Gemma, who's done a lot of the work to get this, this fringe together, because it does take a lot of work to get these fringes going. So I'd like to hand over to Philip to do the housekeeping rules, please. Thanks, Philip.
And thank you, Mary, for chairing. We're delighted and honoured to have you running this meeting. I'm acting director of the Institute of Historical Research. I'm also director of History and Policy. And just to give a little plug for that, we're a network of over 500 historians dedicated to demonstrating how policymakers of all kinds can benefit from historical insights and expertise. And we're delighted to be partnering with the TUC at the 2021 annual conference and connecting with this theme of dignity at work. And we've got a part of History and Policy is a tremendously vibrant trade union forum, which John Edmonds, who I can see is with us tonight, chairs. So if you're not familiar with our work, do get involved. It's a great initiative, and whatever your background, we want to hear from you and get you involved. So just some very basic housekeeping. You'll all be familiar with it from Zoom. Please, if you're not one of the speakers, keep your sound off, keep muted. But by all means, leave your video on, because it's sometimes reassuring to speakers to see some friendly faces. We will be recording today, and Mary will take questions from the floor after the main discussion has taken place. But don't feel you have to wait to ask a question. Use the chat function to write down any questions that occur to you, and I'll help to feed those in at the end. So thank you all very much for joining us, and back to Mary.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I can see John Lloyd, a friendly face there, who wrote the rules for ATL, rewrote the rules for ATL. That was an experience, wasn't it, John, that neither of us will ever forget. Talk about the acrimony that rules can bring to a union. It's really quite amazing. Before we begin, I'd like to now play a message by this year's president of the TUC Congress, Gail Cartmail, Assistant General Secretary of Unite.
Hello, my name's Gail Cartmail. I'm president of the TUC and Assistant General Secretary for Unite the Union. Trade unionists of my generation, when we think about Walter Citrine, what comes to mind is Citrine's ABC of chairmanship. Yet, as this biography shows, Walter Citrine was an important figure, not just for trade unions, but also for the wider labour movement. He was a mover and shaker. And Walter Citrine's role in helping establish the TUC and making it an influential voice in public affairs has been largely overlooked. And that's what this book and this event is aiming to address. So I'm really, really pleased that his significance is now being recognised with this important event at our Congress. It helps bring a founding forefather to life, and I think with relevance to contemporary challenges we face as a movement today. I know this event will be well attended and really interesting, and I wish you all very well with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail. Gail is, as I'm sure you can aware, as president, she has many places to spend her time. But the great thing about Zoom is that you can do pre-records and you can be everywhere. You can be omnipotent and omnipresent. So that's what Gail is at the moment. So now, without further ado, I'm handing over to Tom to interrogate Jim about Walter Citrine and all his works. Go on, Tom, do your worst.
Well, I shall try to do my best, but thanks, first of all, Mary, for those kind words of introduction. And it's very nice to see you and Jim and Philip and everybody else. Yes, I'll try and interrogate Jim kindly. This is a marvelous book, I must say. I really, really enjoyed reading it. But tell us, Jim, first question. What made you decide to write the book?
Sure. Well, first of all, can I thank Gail and Mary and Tom and indeed Paul Nowak, who we'll hear later, for their assistance and cooperation with this, but also particularly Gemma, who is doing the really slog work, and Phil, who's just come back from holiday, and wonderful to see you all here and to see so many people as well. Why did I decide to write the book? Well, I, first of all, had the same view as most people. This guy wrote an ABC of chairmanship, which was worthy but dull. But in fact, the more I dug into the archives, and he's left a large archive, the more I was taken by his vision. And an expression which I love, he had a capacity to kick a ball into a goal beyond the one originally envisaged. Now that's a rare skill. And it's a skill that he refined and developed, both as TUC General Secretary, as President of the International Federation of Trade Unions, and many other bodies, meeting President Roosevelt, meeting Molotov. So the more I learned, the more I thought, this guy needs a biography. Why hasn't he had one? And then I said, who me? Am I to do it? So initially I did a chapter for a book in 2016, which was well received. And I was encouraged to do the full biography. And so I set about it. But I really do think that in many ways, and the book hopes to establish he has a claim to being, I would say, the foremost trade union labor movement, not just trade unionist, labor movement figure of the 20th century. As it's a big claim, and many others, like Ernest Bevin, of course, would stand in the same category. But I certainly think that Citrine was certainly on a par with Bevin, and in some ways, I would say, more the brains of the actual TUC and what it's become. So why has nobody heard of him? He was, I think, overshadowed by Bevin. Bevin's had 6 biographies at least. And of course, as Foreign Secretary, he would have. And he was also an intriguing character who, you know, would sort of do well for, biographically. But Citrine was also vilified by the communist movement at the time, who he prevented taking control of the British unions, like it happened in Germany and other places. And so they never forgot it for him. He was always distorted, played down, and I think generally vilified by the Comintern and Moscow and so on. But he was also, people don't think of Naib Bivan as a wonderful character now because of National Health Service, but quite a nasty take on Citrine through Tribune at the time. So again, Citrine was pushed aside. He was a bureaucrat. He was a backroom guy. You know, he had no color, and therefore they more or less wiped him out of the scene. And he left the scene, of course, in 1947 to become chair of the, first of all, a member of the Coal Board, National Coal Board, and then secondly, chair of the Electricity Authority. So for all those reasons, I think he didn't get much coverage, but he wrote, and I would recommend to people, he wrote 2 volumes of a wonderful autobiography of his own life, which I've based a lot of my work on and checked it and so on. So that's what I would say, Tom.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm reminded of what Clem Attlee kind of famously said about Citrine, which was that he had files the way other people had piles, which was
that was Naib Bivan too.
But it was funny, obviously, and he was famous, as you say, for being a bureaucrat, being very good at filing. But as an ex-TUC bureaucrat myself, what's wrong with it having a good filing system, I would say. But anyway, tell us a bit about the kind of man that he was, his upbringing and his education.
Yeah.
You know, where did he come from, and how did he manage to acquire the skills that he had?
Well, he came from Merseyside, Wallasey, in fact, but he was born in Liverpool in 1887, and their family moved to Wallasey on the Wirral 2 years later, where he grew up in a seafaring family. All his family went to sea at one point. His father was a ship's rigger. Equally interesting, his mother was Scottish Presbyterian stock, and he was educated in the local Presbyterian school. And I think he got a lot of his discipline, a lot of his very coherent approach to life from that very sort of ethical background. He left school at 12, which a lot of trade union leaders obviously at the time did, but he developed intellectual and occupational skills, not just occupational, intellectuals, through self-education, bookkeeping, shorthand, which is an amazing skill, which he used to take minutes of meetings and so on, which I'll tell you a bit more about. Economics, he studied the Webbs and very closely. Literary classics, he spent a lot of his time when he was unemployed in the Picton Library, a reading room, Hornby Library in Liverpool, and he read all the classics, Dickens, Shakespeare. So he had quite a rounded education, but he was also driven by ambition to be a Labour political or union career. He tried politics. He stood for Wallasey seat in 1918. Didn't win, of course, but then made up his mind that he would devote his time to a union career. And that's what he did. He was a natural. He became national officer in Manchester for his union and practically saved them with his analysis of the finances and handling.
This is the electricians' union at the time.
Yeah, the electricians' union, with his admin abilities and so on. And so he walked into a position as Assistant General Secretary of the TUC in 1923-24. He was plucked from 400 candidates, and he got about a 2-minute interview before they said, "You're it." And he took on the job of sorting out the TUC's finances. Hardly a year had passed when fate struck down the General Secretary, Fred Bramley. And Citrine was then in Moscow on a tour of Russia. So he was called back and he was told, you are going to be the acting general secretary. And of course, 1925 was the beginning of the coal dispute, which led to the general strike in 1926. So could he have been tossed into a bigger cauldron? And he swam. He showed that ability to come to terms with such a complex, but because he had quite an experience as a negotiator, as a full-time official on Merseyside in the shipbuilding and engineering industry and the electrical employers. So one of the things I think that stand out when he became General Secretary of the TUC, of course, at the same time, Ernie Bevan joined the General Council, 1925. And Ernie Bevan was known as Napoleon for his particular robust style of trade unionism. And the first clash he had was with Citrine in the General Council. Why? Bevan attacked the head of research for publishing an article in a New York journal. Said I was outrageous and so on. Tore strips off him. At lunchtime, the heads of department went in to see Citrine and said, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to let him get away with this? If so, we will not attend again because we are being treated badly. So he had thought about it. He said, let me have it in writing. He went into the typical coolness. He went into the General Council and at the appropriate moment, he actually picked up Bevan and said, you would not do this to your own staff. And you're not going to do it here. And of course, Bevan immediately flew off the handle. He wasn't given for his calm, easy responses. He's
not used to being treated in that sort of way at all, I shouldn't think.
He stormed out of the meeting and he said, the General Secretary has got his knife in for me. And of course, the rest of the council almost clapped because they regarded Citrine or Bevan as too big for his boots in some ways, many of them. But what it established was that in the eyes of the staff, first of all, who remained loyal to Citrine as a team from there on, but also in the eyes of the General Council, large and small unions, that ability to stand up to some of the big boys rather than allow them to run the show. And that was Citrine's distinctive contribution. And he didn't do it immediately. He built up an authority over a decade to actually, so that when he did speak, he spoke for the movement as a whole. And that was his formative period.
So let's move on to the general strike then, because this is now 1925. And as you say, the coal dispute has been simmering for a while, and there's been public inquiries, parliamentary inquiries and so on, governments involved in the mine owners. When the big dispute emerged in 26, and as we all know, eventually after 9 days had to collapse and turned into frankly a failure, many people held Citrine responsible for that. Was that fair? Do you think that's right?
No, it wasn't fair. And in fact, I don't think that he can be blamed for the failure if it was a failure. For this reason, the TUC at the time, about 4 million altogether, marshaled 2 million of the unions, obviously the big coal miners union, but also the TNG, AEU, mainly manual unions, although there were a number of clerical unions as well. And they presented the government with the biggest demonstration, biggest protest ever about the dignity at work and about the dignity of labor at the time. And then this was back in the 1920s. And they amazingly stayed out for 9 days. Never been heard of again. Syndicalists have always talked about the general strike and all the rest of it, but they were talking about an hour or 2 hours or at maximum a day. But for 9 days, the British working class held firm. And at the end, they had to be persuaded to go back in many cases. And it was that problem that the leadership of the TUC really came unstuck. because they were conned by the government into believing that the matter would be settled with the miners and that they would be renegotiated a return to work and all that. Didn't happen. Instead of which, victimization and people trailing back confusedly. So it became and it remains a divisive episode. But if you think about it, Citrine throughout actually advised the General Council, and he was the officer to the negotiating committee. He said, look, that little battle we had in 1925, it was called Red Friday, when they forced the government to back off. That was really a skirmish. What you're now going to face is a very concerted and a very planned government and state defense. And sure enough, that was exactly what was going on. But he said to them, if you really want to take on the government, you're going to have to prepare, and they didn't. And so, in fact, the miners' leaders, Arthur Cook and Herbert Smith, never blamed Citrine for letting them down. They were very appreciative of his efforts, and they congratulated him to the point of nominating him for the substantive General Secretary position in September 1926. So far from it. And in the book, I've got a lovely picture of Arthur Cook sitting beside Citrine in a Manor House hospital when Citrine was in hospital in 1931. And so they had quite a good friendship, even though Citrine was very critical of Cook and very critical of the miners' leadership for not negotiating a deal and so on. So that obviously in a nutshell seems to put one point of view of, but I firmly believe that the TUC cannot be blamed for the general strike.
Because ultimately, of course, it was a decision of the General Council to call the strike off anyway. And, if anyone's to blame, then it's a collective responsibility of the whole General Council. But moving on, obviously, after the strike, there was terrible, savage retribution from the coal owners. Many miners and other unions that had supported them, the railwaymen, notably, steelworkers, they were they suffered victimization, and many of them lost their jobs. And obviously the union movement as a whole then suffered and lost a lot of members, and its prestige was certainly massively affected. How did Citrine lead the fight back? How did he rebuild the organization after that and turn it into what was to become one of the most powerful trade union movements in the world?
Right. Well, the first thing he did was he led the defense of the TUC over the conduct of the general strike. They had a whole day in January 1927 where all the unions came together, all the union executives, and Arthur Cook and Herbert Smith presented the NUM critique of the thing. And it was a fairly rough session. Citrine, again, was the one put up to actually answer point by point, and he did. And quite convincingly, the vote in the Congress was running to about 6-1. With the miners, of course, having a big chunk themselves, and that. But that was that defense. Sorry,
6-1 in favour of Citrine, do you mean?
In favour of Citrine. In other words, in favour of the actions taken by the General Council. But a lot of these attacks were Soviet-inspired, certainly Comintern and the Communist Party, because they wanted a revolution in 1926, and they were deadly disappointed that general strike didn't lead on to one. It was ridiculous, of course, but that were the times. The Soviet Union was then an international force and pumping money into those militant, and there was a minority group and so on. A lot of them, I think, were misguided. But the other thing they did more positively, they regrouped, and both Citrine and Bevin gets great credit for this too. They actually sat down and thought, how are we going to recover and restore relations? Because after all, unions exist to negotiate. They exist to deal with employers. If they don't have that ability, they don't exist. So they sat down and they developed what was called the Mond-Turner talks. This was Albert Mond, who was the chairman of ICI, later became a lord and so on, and Ben Turner from the textile workers. He happened to be president of the TUC that year, but it was Citrine whose idea it was and who pushed it through. And the sort of things they reached agreement with the major employers were recognition of trade unions, collective bargaining rights, and so on. Sadly, it came to nothing because the employers' organization pulled out right in the middle of the Great Depression, 1929. And so, but the idea, the germ was established, and with the recovery in the 30s, it was that approach which restored the TUC. The other thing is that, unlike Germany or Europe, the TUC didn't split. All over Europe, you have 2 or 3 federations politically aligned or religiously aligned. That didn't happen. They held it together quite coherently. And I think the third bit, I would say, is the building of a team in Congress House of high caliber staff. He recruited lots of talented people. Some were graduates, some were like Herbert Tracy, his publicity man, had a similar background to his own. Walter Milne Bailey was the head of research from a syndicalist background, and so on, but very, very able. George Woodcock, who later became General Secretary. These were the caliber of staff, and they had an ethos. They had an ethos developed around Citrine. And I mentioned him standing up for Milne Bailey against Ernest Bevin. That sort of thing is what cultivates loyalty. And so he brought them to Congress every year, and they actually had a part in the thing. And this was a team which then had respect from the government because they were able to negotiate effectively. And they knew their stuff. And the TUC started to develop as one of the great centers of industrial relations excellence, advising the unions, advising the government, and so on. So that was the recovery. And that was, you're right, that was the greatest achievement of Citrine.
It's interesting that, because I mean, I'd like to think that the TUC today maintains that reputation and those standards for very detailed, objective, clearly argued, well-presented, professional evidence, and I'm sure it does, as do many unions.
That's right.
And in those days, that commanded respect because governments responded, employers responded. You might say today, governments would do well to pay a bit more respect, and they should respond, and they clearly don't. As Mary's just said, Gavin Williamson, being a case in point. Anyway.
Let me just say, Tom, as well, that what is interesting is how the TUC has evolved from a mainly manual-based unions into a whole much more sort of diverse grouping of white-collar professional and stuff. And the idea that they have a general secretary who's a woman, Frances O'Grady, President Gail Cartmail, many union leaders, Mary herself, of course, Christine McAnania, Unison, and Sharon Graham now in Unite. So this is an example of an organization that has evolved, that is evolving, and that can reflect the workforce that we have today. So I just thought I'd put that one in.
No, I entirely agree. Well, this is maybe the final question from me, Jim, and then we'll throw it open to the chat room and so on. But we've got to understand of where he came from and the kind of man he was and how he recovered, and the union movement recovered from the trauma, you might say, of the general strike. What do you think, in a nutshell, might be, one or two of his greatest achievements that he then subsequently put in place in the years up to and including the Second World War?
Well, there were many, obviously, but I would particularly pick out his role and his work with former colonial workers in the Caribbean, particularly in introducing trade unionism there. I mean, it's little known about, but In 1937, there were riots, big riots across Trinidad, Jamaica, and what have you, because of the maltreatment by the planters and the government, the colonial governments there, of the workers, abysmal conditions, abysmal housing conditions, no rights, what have you. But the TUC, Bevan and Citrine, Bevan was chair of the council, they set up a colonial advisory committee, which started to lobby the government to do something about this situation. And Citrine got himself onto the Royal Commission that was set up after the riots. It was called the Moyne Commission. Lord Moyne was one of the Guinness family. And they all went out to the Caribbean for 6 months. And they toured all the islands. Now, Citrine was, in fact, disgusted and indignant by what he found. He said, I will never again hear talk of our trusteeship of the coloured peoples of the empire without a feeling of shame at the callous way in which we have neglected them. He didn't pull any punches. He set about, he didn't just make these speeches, he set about coaching the local union leaders, the local rebels, into how they would present their case rather than rioting, present their case to the Moyne Commission. And he went to their homes. A lot of these leaders who were regarded as communists, regarded as agitators, people not to be sort of talked to, but Citrine did. And he ended up also having a go with Lord Moyne to ensure that his recommendations were radical, and they were. But when Citrine died in 1983, the Prime Minister of Barbados, one M.G. Adams was his name, he wrote to the Times praising Citrine's courage and invaluable assistance, he called it, to his father, Grantley Adams. Grantley was one of the big rebels and union leaders. In founding the Barbados Workers' Union, he said his dad had spoken with warmth and affection for Lord Citrine. Now that, to me, spoke volumes. A letter to the Times. He didn't have to send it. Clearly, he felt, and there was a great reverence for Citrine's. So that would be, for me, another of his great achievements. Obviously, the TUC is the big one, but
yes,
this showed his commitment to the dignity of labour. And I can go on another time to talk about his role with the women of the TUC, of which there were then, of course, 500,000. But it was very much a male organization, and very much. But Citrine actually did a lot to cultivate some of the women leaders in the General Council, and some of the veterans who he called together in 1938 to discuss their lives, to discuss their aims, to discuss how they should go forward.
And yeah, I remember that well. And he talked to them about what more the TUC could do, what more the unions could do as a movement to help women workers.
That's right.
So in some ways, he was ahead of his time, I think, both on the Caribbean front and on the.
Very much so. He had a very deep sympathy for all the different groups in the.
Yes.
And he was far from being a bureaucrat. In other words, far from being this sort of remote character who didn't have any feeling for the people and the distortion of his life. That's why I tried to bring out that you go back to being an electrician in Liverpool. One of his famous sayings in Liverpool, he said he was wiring a house in Wallasey, the better houses in Wallasey, who had electricity at the time. Nobody else had electricity in 1911 or what have you. And he said, one day, I and all my members, he didn't just say, and all workers will have electricity in their homes. And the irony was that 40, 50 years later, as chairman of the Electricity Council, he actually was responsible for introducing electricity to rural England, rural Wales, rural Scotland, rural Northern Ireland. because it had been achieved in the cities, but not there. So there's a lovely sort of irony in this man. He didn't just see it as an electrician. He was thinking, what is the social implication of this stuff?
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much indeed. And I'd suggest that having had those few questions from me that kind of set the scene, and thanks very much indeed, Jim, for all that. Mary, shall I hand back to you and see what questions we have from the participants?
Yeah, that's fine. I can do the questions. First of all, though, thanks very much, Tom, for really good questions because Jim knows so much. It's quite hard to ask the questions which start, giving a shape and, eking out what he knows so well. So that's been really great. Thank you very much. So there are some questions from the fringe goers. Do think of more, but the first one is from Mike Smith, who asked you, Jim, could you say more about Citrine's role in World War II and his visits to both the USA and Russia?
Right. If you've got 2 hours, I can.
We haven't got 2 hours. We'll have to give it.
I could do that, but no. His role in World War II. We'll take second. First of all, he visited Russia 6 times, would I believe. 1925, 1935, 1941, 42. All of those times on business, on TUC business, even though one of them was supposed to be a personal visit. And his diaries, which he kept a diary of what he saw and what the Soviet Union was like, is probably one of the best observers' accounts and fair-minded accounts. I'm not going to go into it any more than that, except to say he was very he started off being very pro-Lenin and pro the communist revolution in the 1917 revolution. But as he went on and as he saw the interference by the Comintern in West European unions and the divisive, disruptive approach that they were adopting, he became very anti. And he was known as an anti-communist. But he was never ideologically anti-communist in the sense that he was a socialist, a very strong socialist throughout his life. But he would sort of, he had to lead the trade unions, the International Trade Union Federation based in Amsterdam. And you can imagine how complex that was to sort of keep the Comintern from exploiting divisions, but at the same time to give a positive lead to the union. So I think he did that, and I deal with that in the book in some detail. He visited the USA, and we'll talk about that, in 1940. He actually was there in 1934, 1936, but 1940 we'll talk about, because he went during the Blitz. He went with Churchill's complete blessing. And why? Because America was still not in the war, and there was a strong isolationist mood, particularly in the unions. And so he went to New Orleans to persuade them that Britain would fight. And of course, this was the thing where Germany had walked through Europe like a knife through butter. And it was thought it would be a matter of time before they'll arrive in London. And Citrine gave a speech, which Roosevelt saw and was sent to him and arranged to meet him. And he sort of was thrilled by Citrine's talk. In fact, he said, some of the reports said he brought tears to their eyes to say how heroic the British workers were, British people were, in standing up to Hitler. And that was, so the other country, of course, where he went was Canada. And I'm very pleased to see Carol Moher here from Douro, Rummer. But the Canadian Prime Minister at the time was so impressed as well. So Citrine was, in a sense, an envoy. He was a semi-official envoy to the Americans, and he met Roosevelt a number of times afterwards, and we'll talk about that. But that, I hope, gives you a flavor of his visits to both. Oh yes, I must say, 1934, 1936. He just come from Germany. He just come from Berlin, where the IFTU was meeting, where Hitler was taking over, where Hitler was pulling out the root by the roots, the trade union movement and the socialist movement. And he gave a powerful speech to the TUC to say, look, this is the danger. This is what's coming. This is what's coming.
Because he could see at first hand what was happening in Berlin, because that's where he was going for the meetings.
That's right. But he then went to America, and because one of the papers there, the Jewish Vanguard, they published his speech in full, verbatim. And he went to America, and the editor took him on a tour. So in other words, because the Jewish people in America were very sensitive to the rise of Hitler, but not a lot of Americans. They thought it was just another European squabble. And so he actually made the case, and they set up an anti-fascist council in New York and in London. And platforms 1936 were addressed by Churchill and many of the other anti-fascists. So he was at the center of the national effort.
Because he formed a strong relationship with Churchill, I think, didn't he? Partly because they'd shared a platform through the 30s. And there's a lovely story in the book. I hope you forgive me for telling it, Jim, but about during the war, there's the Blitz, the bombs are raining down on Downing Street. In the bunker underneath Downing Street, there's Citrine and Churchill, because Citrine was there having a meeting, and of course the air raid siren goes off, and off they go down to the bomb shelter. And to kind of pass the time, Citrine and Churchill are singing songs from Gilbert and Sullivan and reciting poetry that that both of them liked. And that's the kind of relationship that he had with Churchill, who deeply admired him and was in some way converted to the cause of trade unionism, a limited extent in the war, because of the respect he had for Citrine.
That's right. Churchill always offered him a whiskey and soda and a cigar, neither of which he took. But then they sat together, and they started to sing and to recite poetry to keep their spirits up. Ye Mariners of England, and all that sort of stuff. Which they both had phenomenal memories, and they went back to their childhood and what they learned at primary school, as you do. And so yes, a very warm relationship, but it was never too close. And Citrine was always careful to maintain the independence of the TUC and the trade union. And he would regularly have a go at Churchill over various things, and Bevin when he was Minister of Labour, because his view was, look, we can't go back to our members and the unions and sort of tell them they must do this and they must do that, because they will abandon us.
And that was a clear distinction between himself and Bevin, because of course Bevin by then was part of the government.
That's right.
He was not part of the trade union movement, he was part of the government, whereas Citrine was still very, very much part of the trade union movement, leading it.
Yes. Yeah. Although Bevin always still presented as the trade union, the workers' proletarian.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Tom, I'll let you come in again, but we've got a question and a follow-up question. A question from Keith Flett and another question which is a follow-up from Philip, somebody else. So Philip, could you read those two questions for Jim? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. Keith says, as James suggested, Citrine had a bad historical press on the left. Looking at his work and legacy, what is perhaps the key counter to point to how he left the movement stronger and better able to fight for working people? So that's a sort of that's a broad one, and I suppose I had a more specific question, and it's really that it's always difficult for governing parties when they're out of office for a while to maintain a sort of sense of purpose and direction. And Citrine led the TUC in the 30s, which was a pretty grim time for Labour, with major defeats in 31 and 35. So what specifically does Citrine's approach in the 30s suggest about how Labour can kind of keep its sense of direction now?
Yes. Well, in a nutshell, it was called the National Council of Labour.
Right.
After the experience of the 1920s, two Labour governments, minority Labour governments, and then Ramsay MacDonald deserting at his leadership, clearly the unions and the Labour Party were completely disgusted, but they were also destroyed. They had 46 MPs from having a few hundred, and so they had to regroup. And Citrine had been trying throughout the latter period, particularly the 29-31 government, to persuade MacDonald to consult more with the trade unions. And needless to say, it didn't happen. And they fell out badly in the end over the budget. But Citrine's proposal was that they should meet regularly as a joint body on policy to thrash out any problems, any differences, arguments, and so on, and then present a united face. Now, they did it from 1932 onwards. And two of the big achievements of Labour resulted directly from Citrine's, first of all, the anti-fascist stance, which was so strong through the TUC, but also the rearmament policy, because you can imagine the Labour Party was very pacifist, as after the First World War particularly, but generally pacifist in its outlook. And so they had to persuade them, but it was the TUC that actually led the way. And they said, look, and Citrine made one of the most powerful speeches in 1935 on this. He said, the only thing dictators understand is if you fight them. We've got to fight. And that was the message. And at one point, even Clem Attlee was dragging his feet, because there were powerful pacifist forces like Stafford Cripps and Lansbury, in other words. And he said they had a special meeting, with a joint meeting of the two executives, TUC and the Labour Party. And they read the riot act to them. They said, look, unless you come out openly, this is over Abyssinia and the invasion by Mussolini, unless you come out and say that the League of Nations will not just impose useless sanctions, but will actually arm and fight, then we will go out independently and we will say, this is the TUC policy. We are in favor of rearmament. We are in favor of defense. And so the Attlee and the others, Cripps, they gave way. And so the policy was changed, so that by 1936, Labour was, and of course the Spanish Civil War had started, Labour was strongly online as a result, I believe, of that coherence given by the National Council of Labour. Have I done justice to your question, Philip?
I think you have. I think the answers are just amazing, Jim. I think they really are. So there's one here from Jeff. I think something key about Citrine and Bevan's leadership was sound economics. They opposed the gold standard and then austerity against the Labour leadership. In doing so, they were allies with Keynes. I wonder if you had any comment about Citrine's relationship with Keynes.
Right. Well, yes, Citrine admired Keynes from the 1920s. His first book, The Consequences of Mr. Churchill, was because of the government had come off the gold standard, come back on the gold standard, but at a high level of value, which ended in British exports being priced out of the market, including particularly coal. And they believed that the general strike was a direct result of Churchill's and that government policy. So he was on, they were very much aligned in their outlook. Equally importantly, Keynes was developing his policies his policies of intervention by the government, rather than the traditional non-interventionist approach of the economists who ran the Treasury, who ran the Bank of England, who ran different government departments. And so they had to, Citrine was very supportive. Bevan was very good. Bevan actually sat on the Macmillan Commission on finance, and he was very radical in their approach. They were making the point, look, that the City of London favors the international pound, strength of the pound internationally. It doesn't favor British industry. And as a result, they were very much pressing on that policy. So I think that Keynes was using the TUC. He wanted to use the TUC, and the TUC was delighted to be used on this particular topic. So Keynes's name was made, of course, when they came off the gold standard again in 1932, even though it was now the national government. They had to do it. And so Keynes's was upheld. And I think that, I think that his reputation owed a lot to that TUC support.
And Citrine wasn't afraid to criticize Snowden.
Not at all. He hated Snowden.
Very good. Thank you. And we've got another question from John Edmonds here. Hello, John. The relationship between Citrine and Attlee was often fraught. Can you explain why, Jim?
Yes, it was partly ideological, but it was also practical. Attlee became leader of the Labour Party by accident, 1935. He wasn't rated by anybody, and certainly not even by Bevan. But he became leader, and Citrine said, fair play to him. He's taken on the job, which is a thankless job, given that we've only got 46 MPs. Then in the 1935 election, they got more. But Citrine met Attlee first, Major Attlee, he was called, as part of the Socialist League, which Stafford Cripps actually had brought. This was a sort of left-wing Labour Party force for socialism and so on. But Attlee and Cripps, they all visited Citrine at his home to persuade him to their view, and because he was quite scathing of a lot of their policy. I won't go into it into the detail of it, but I think from there on in, Citrine and Attlee never hit it off. They also disagreed over the danger of fascism and Hitler. And we have a speech which I reproduced in the book to show that Attlee, in fact, didn't really appreciate the full danger. So moving on to 1940, of course, Bevan became government minister. Citrine was offered a position in the government, which he declined. He said, I would prefer to stay at the TUC. And in the course of the coalition government, I think that Citrine and Attlee didn't get on. He tried to persuade Attlee to reform the 1927 Trade Union Act, which the postal workers were really up in arms with. They couldn't affiliate to the TUC. They couldn't affiliate to the Labour Party. And what's his name? Attlee used to say, he said no to him, but Citrine said about Attlee, he said, the problem is he doesn't tell us anything. He comes to the General Council, he comes to the National Council of Labour, he sits there chewing his pipe and doodling. He doesn't give us the benefit of his mind. And we expect it. So
that was a mistake. Do you think that was a mistake not joining the government? I know several very critical, after the war, the TUC was invited in and didn't, so was that a mistake?
No, I don't think it was, because they had a different role to play. Citrine actually went along to Churchill 1940, and Churchill said, look, I'm very disappointed that you didn't agree to come in the government. But he said, I want you to become a Privy Councillor instead. Now, being a Privy Councillor, a lot of people don't understand, gave him access to every government department, gave him access to the Prime Minister. When they used to say, you can discuss confidential matters on Privy Council terms. So, in fact, the TUC had the best of both worlds. They joined most of the production committees, and there were hundreds of them all over the country. They brought in trade unionists from everywhere onto having a say. Of course, they had suspended the right to strike. Of course, they had dropped demarcation rights and so on. But in return, they were very closely involved in the entire war effort. And at the end of it, people like Churchill praised them to the sky and said, forevermore, we will love the unions and we will take them to our breast and so on. But in fact, after the war, TUC were quite powerful and they were seen as an estate of the realm. That was largely due to Citrine's adroit handling of his relations with the government, I believe.
Interesting.
Are there any more questions in the chat, Philip? Yeah, you're on mute still.
Sorry, I'm out of practice with Zoom. No, sorry, I can't see anything at the moment. Would anyone else like to? Would anyone else?
Can I ask a
Yes,
question
Tom,
here?
you can. Yeah.
I mean, what's always puzzled me about Citrine is that he, as Jim has said, he became a towering national figure throughout the Second World War. Privy Councillor, first name terms with Churchill, Attlee, Bevan, half the cabinet. And yet, within 12 months of the end of the war, not quite 12 months, bit more than that, Jim will know the details far better than I do, but he'd left the TUC. He didn't really get anything like the recognition that he should have done personally, even though the TUC did. And he ends up with a kind of medium level position at the coal board. And then he ends up running what effectively became the electricity generating board. So what happened, Jim? Is that really all because you fell out with Attlee, and was it really so kind of rancorous? That, I mean, it seems a strange.
That was part of it.
At the height of his powers, really, and he suddenly moved to a different career.
That's right. It's a long story, and I tried to trace it in the book. But and again, coming back to John Edmonds' question about the relationship, I didn't finish going on to where the relationship went, but Citrine tried to establish an international solidarity of workers. When he went to Russia in 1941, part of the deal was to enable the British unions and the Russian unions to work together, which would solidify the alliance, which was then very rickety, 1941, because Stalin was very upset that Churchill wouldn't open the second front. So one of the promises Citrine gave Molotov, who he met, was that we will try to bring in the American unions into the alliance. And so, because they were still not in the war. But of course, when Citrine went to America, he found the American unions, particularly the AFL, American Federation of Labor, not the CIO, which was the other one.
Because at this time, the two of them hadn't joined together; they were still separate.
They were very hostile. They were very anti-communist, and they didn't want anything to do with American unions. So, as this rumbled on, Citrine continued to try to weld together an international forum. They called it the World Federation of Trade Unions. It was set up in 1945, but they went to San Francisco for the inaugural meeting of the United Nations, expecting to be part of the British delegation.
This is at the end of the war, yeah.
This is at the end of 1945, April 1945. And Attlee turned round and Eden to Citrine and said, no, we've discussed it in the cabinet. And I'm afraid that we don't think it's appropriate that you participate in our delegation, either as observers or as full members of the delegation, even though the Russians were incorporating their unions, obviously, as were the Americans. And so Citrine was devastated. He had an up and down with Attlee and accused him that he had never done anything for the trade unions. He said that when we get back to London, I'm going to make a full-scale issue of this for the TUC, and he had the TUC chairman with him. So that was the way things were going. But of course, what happened next was, of course, that the war collapsed in Europe. Germany surrendered. And the focus shifted to when are we going to have a general election? And of course, everybody believed, including Bevin, including Attlee, that Churchill would walk away with the election result. Didn't happen, of course. But all of this clouded over Citrine's issue and the TUC's issue. And because the government, Labour government, was returned with a whacking majority, a radical program, and everybody was happy with the things that were going to happen, they quickly forgot about San Francisco and the international solidarity of the working class. But it was a pity, because I think Citrine would have influenced the United Nations Charter. For instance, he did a lot of work with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, on standards, work standards, hours of work, health and safety, a whole range of things. And he wanted to incorporate them in the United Nations Charter of Fundamental Rights. Never happened, still hasn't happened.
Okay, we have two more questions and I'm going to stop it there. So this is quite a quick one, really, and then the last one from Philip, who I'll let Philip ask his own question. So Tim Hughes, Citrine lived until 1983. Did he have views on how industrial relations developed in the 70s and even perhaps the events of 78 to 79?
Yes, indeed. Of course, once he left the coal board and the electricity industry, he felt he wasn't prejudiced from attending the House of Lords in his capacity as Baron Citrine of Wembley. And he did, from about 1958 onwards, he was very active in the Lords. And he was also he was always cutting out clippings about industrial relations, about what was happening at the TUC. And he had very strong views about what was happening. And he felt, one of the things he felt, which I think he was right about, was that the unions were allowing the national agreements to go by the board, and in favor of collective bargaining at the plant, at the workshop, which is what the shop stewards wanted. And he felt that they were giving away a lot of the reason for their power. So that was, there were many other things. He made some great speeches in the House of Lords, not least in favor of the postal workers in 1971, who were on strike and who were beaten by the government after a 9-week strike. And he made a powerful intervention to the minister concerned, demanding that he do something, and so on. So that was, I think he was amazing. He was then in his 70s, late 70s, and his health started to get better. His wife died in 1973, so he moved to Devon, and the distance was too great for him. But he still remained active, and you know, he died in 1983 when he was 95. So amazing character.
Yeah, amazing. And the last question is, I'm letting Philip ask the last question.
Yeah, it's just to make sure we don't get sued under the Trades Descriptions Act, because we do, in the title of this event, we talk about dignity at work in the Walter Citrine era. And I just wonder how Citrine would have approached this term, what he did to promote dignity of work, and what lessons that the current TUC might take from his approach to dignity at work.
Yeah, well, I mean, my opening remarks, I thought I would have said, as an electrician in Merseyside, seeing the houses of the wealthy being wired and not the ordinary workers, he had that sense of dignity But of course, the biggest example of the dignity which he fought for was, of course, the Second World War. What the fascists had done to the trade unions, what they had done to the people of Europe, the Jews of Europe. What dignity, they removed anything and removed the trade unions. So that, I think, Citrine, the thread runs through. I mentioned the Anti-Fascist Council, that he always saw things, I think, in terms of that dignity. And when he talked to the female trade union leaders, he was very interested in their sort of sweated labor, the difficulties they had encountered in recruiting women in the 1910s and 1920s, the trade boards. All of those things were big issues of dignity. They were all about what was an atrocious condition. And the general strike was all about that. It was about, why did they stay out 9 days in support of the miners? The most despised group in many ways, underground all their lives, without dignity. And so I think that all his life was about dignity.
Mm.
That is marvellous. It's been an absolutely marvellous event, Jim. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I am going to. But I've been completely won over, and I will read it with great interest. And John now is showing his copy. Good man. So I'd like to thank you for the marvellous exposition you've given of your wide-ranging and fascinating knowledge of the period of Citrine's life, but also all the events that he was involved in. It's absolutely encyclopedic, fantastic knowledge. Tom, I'd like to thank you for kicking off the discussion so expertly and so well, and helping Jim into unpicking. It's not easy, that unpicking what you know. The questions really helped. I'd like to thank Philip for also helping with the questions, and Gemma for doing all the admin work. I'd like to thank everyone who's attended the Fringe for attending, and we're going to finish with a message from Paul Novak, Deputy General Secretary of the TUC. So thank you very much, one and all.
Well, good evening. My name is Paul Novak. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC. Really pleased to be able to join you, albeit virtually and albeit briefly this evening, to mark the launch of this new biography of Walter Citrine by Jim Moher. Let me just start by paying tribute to Jim for the work that he's done in pulling together what I think is a really readable biography, but it's actually a really fascinating insight into one of the forgotten giants of the British labour movement, Walter Citrine. Now, I have to admit, I have a slight bias towards Citrine. I'm talking to you this evening from Birkenhead in my shed, just a few miles down the Mersey from Wallasey, where Citrine grew up and cut his teeth as a young trade unionist in the Electricians' Union on the Merseyside docks. And so I think Jim has managed to sort of pull together a really, as I say, readable account of the contribution that Citrine made to the TUC, but to the wider labour movement as well. And Citrine did lead the TUC through some incredible world events and some big moments in our national history, everything from the general strike in 1926 through to the contribution of the TUC and our unions during the Second World War, that was such an essential part of the British war effort. Lots of lessons you can draw from this biography, lots that we can learn from Citrine's life. Let me just maybe pick out three key things. First of all, Citrine is without a doubt the father of the modern TUC. He took a poorly organised, quite loose national trade union centre and turned it into something that resembles the TUC even today. He turned it into a professional, effective campaigning force, lobbying force on behalf of Britain's trade unions. And he managed, I think, to galvanise our unions, to bring unions together, to allow them to put their faith in the TUC as a national centre, to build up that national centre. It never quite got to be the general staff that Citrine imagined of the labour movement, but I think the fact that we're still here so many decades on, still representing and advocating on behalf of our unions effectively. The fact that we're still held as an important player by governments and by policymakers alike is in large part due to the legacy that was handed down by Citrine and so many others around that General Council table. The second thing, you know, we're obviously having this meeting as we begin to emerge from the pandemic and the international crisis that has been provoked by COVID-19. And, you know, Citrine led the TUC and the Labour movement through the Second World War, and I think demonstrated the value of unions at that particular period of national crisis, but actually the value of unions much more beyond that as well. Proved that it wasn't just at times of national crisis that unions had an essential role to play. Proved that, of course, our primary purpose is to represent workers and to do that as effectively as we can, but also a strong independent trade union movement has a huge amount to offer employers, a huge amount to offer our politics, a huge amount to offer our society more broadly. And each and every day, and it comes through in the account that Jim has written, Citrine lived and breathed that and really made the case for unions to be at the table. I suppose the third point I'd make is that Citrine was an internationalist, and you only have to look at the work that he did during the Second World War for proof positive of that. It was Citrine that built relationships with unions and indeed with governments in Russia and in the US and indeed across Europe and around the world. And I think it is really important that we remember we're part of a global labour movement, that we rise and fall as a global labour movement, and that the work that we do to support our sisters and brothers in other parts of the world and that they do to support us is really at the heart of what we are as trade unionists, because the interests of workers don't stop at the borders of England or of Britain or of the UK or indeed the European Union. We've got a shared interest with workers right around the world, and I think Citrine again embodied that commitment to global trade unionism and to internationalism. So you're going to hear from others during the course of this evening about their take on Citrine's contribution. From my perspective, it was just amazing to read sort of the fascinating insights into Citrine's life. The fact that while many things have changed since he was General Secretary of the TUC in the 20s, 30s and 40s, some things remained. Sometimes our relationship with our affiliated unions has ups and it has downs. Sometimes our relationships with the Labour Party has ups and downs, and sometimes our relationships with governments led by Conservatives can have certainly more downs than ups. But through it all, Citrine, I think, led the TUC with integrity, with commitment, and with a genuine belief that, you know, stronger, that together we are stronger, that unity is strength, and the TUC has an essential role in making sure that we live that and embody that as we go forward